Wanted to talk a little bit about the regulation of natural monopoly, and there's some issues related to regulating monopolies that when an industry could be competitive or it could be a monopoly. A natural monopoly presents a special case where the best market structure from the point of view of society is a monopoly, that multiple small firms serving the market would just have such high costs that the price to consumers would be considerably higher than the monopoly price. And so I'm not going to draw the lines, but let me just show you. Remember that the unregulated monopolist would have a marginal revenue curve well below the demand curve. They would produce where marginal costs and marginal revenue were equal, would charge a price to consumers off the demand curve, and that price would be higher than the competitive price and output would be lower. In the case of natural monopoly, we have this outcome where the optimal structure is a monopoly, and there's lots of examples. The one I've chosen here is the retail electricity distribution. Actually, wholesale production of electricity has largely been deregulated, somewhat problematically deregulated in the transition anyway, but now it seems to be working okay. So power producers sell directly to the grid, but the retail distribution, getting electricity to people living in towns and cities in particular, that's still regulated by the authorities here in Forest Grove and Portland, just about anywhere you go. The most common way, I'm going to look at three types of regulation. One, average cost price rule, far the most common. Marginal cost price rule, it exists in the economy in places that I'll talk about. And then state ownership, a little bit less common, and but actually an interesting example right here in Forest Grove. So let's get started. The first case, average cost price rule. Here I call it the state, but the government. Well, usually it's a municipal government. I'm using state for the government. All right, the government makes this deal. This market's going to be monopolized. We only want one firm to produce. Tell you what, we're going to give you the exclusive right to produce, and we'll use our government authority to make sure that's honored. But in return, you're going to have to accept some regulation from us. And in particular, the form that regulation typically takes is that government sets a price or tries to set a price where price is just equal to average total cost. So it's the lowest price where the company could make a normal rate of return on serving this market. That's what the regulators are going for. So we'll call this Q sub AC and P sub AC. And at first glance, this seems like a pretty reasonable approach. Notice that, compared to the the unregulated monopoly price is a lot lower, quantity is a lot more. Everybody wins, right? Well, not necessarily. There's a few problems with the average cost price rule. One of them will become apparent when I talk about the marginal cost price rule, or I'll use as the transition to talking about that case. But just to talk in general about these price rules, one of the problems of price rules is that the way they're administered, and this is true for garbage companies, cable companies, retail sewer, retail water, when they're contracted out, electricity usually, all sorts of regulated monopolies in the economy are managed this way. And the problem is when the government sets a price rule saying, hey, okay, well, we'll let you incur reasonable costs of serving this market and then charge a price that lets you earn 7 or 8% on equity, that seems like a good idea, but one of the problems is the company then loses the incentive relative to a private for-profit, profit-maximizing firm. The company, the regulated company, the price-regulated company, now doesn't have any incentive to reduce costs. And so we actually call this the gold-plated water cooler effect. And if you're a manager thinking about, which water cooler should I get for my employees? Well, when you know that the government's just going to let you mark up your price above whatever costs you incur, you may as well get the gold-plated water cooler, even though it doesn't have any improvement in function over the tin-plated or whatever, the stainless steel water cooler, plastic water cooler. But who cares? The company doesn't care anymore because whatever its costs are, they can be passed on to the consumers. And there's all sorts of regulatory hearings where government officials try to ascertain whether the cost increases that were incurred by utilities were necessary or not. But the fact is the government just doesn't have the information necessary to make that call. So this problem with price rule has led to, in the eyes of many economic analysts, overinvestment in capacity. So instead of encouraging electricity conservation through peak load pricing, charging high prices during high demand periods, low pricing during off-peak times. Instead of doing that the way they do in Europe and Japan and other civilized nations, price-regulated companies can just say, we'll build the extra power plant, we'll pass the price on to consumers. As a manager now, I'm managing a bigger enterprise that looks better on my resume. Fine. So this is a problem. This loss of the incentive to reduce costs is a problem. The other problem, and I'll use this as a segue to my analysis of the marginal cost price rule. Notice that at the average cost price rule, this is an inefficient outcome. If we produce one more kilowatt hour, the willingness to pay for that one more kilowatt hour under this price rule is greater than the cost of providing that one more kilowatt hour. So under the average cost price rule, there's a bit of deadweight loss. So I'll shade that, and maybe I'll try to label it without cluttering this too much. Deadweight loss of price, the average cost price rule. And that even if we can somehow get the company to minimize their average cost, which of course is very problematic, maybe impossible for a government regulator. Even if we did that, there'd still be this efficiency problem. So some analysts have suggested instead that government should move to a marginal cost price rule. And the marginal cost price rule has some interesting characteristics. So let's say we charge the marginal cost price rule. We enforce that. Notice that here, the deadweight loss problem, the lack of an incentive to minimize cost still exists, but the deadweight loss problem goes away. That now this is the efficient price equal to marginal cost. The problem with a marginal cost price rule from the point of view of government regulators and for firms that might be regulated in this manner is notice that this efficient price is less than average total cost. So the firm that regulated this way would run a loss in size equal to this green shaded rectangle. And so what do you do? Well, what you do is the government regulator would kick a subsidy to the monopolist to offset this loss, and then everybody's happy, right? And the company breaks even. Consumers get an efficient price. Everybody wins. This can be politically unpopular. See government kicking a subsidy to a monopoly firm. You can think about if you found out Waste Management, the company that does the garbage in Forest Grove, is getting a big kickback. That might be outrageous. Enron way back when was the owner of a lot of these retail power distributors. If they were getting a big kickback, that could be politically problematic. But actually, a lot of places do kick a subsidy to the monopolist, and in return for regulating lower cost prices. And this you can see this a lot in public transportation. A lot of public transportation systems run with a government subsidy, and this could be efficient. That situation is often pointed to as evidence of inefficiency, but it's very possible that outcome is consistent with the efficient regulatory structure. So you can think of the T back in Boston, probably the Metro in Washington, D.C. TriMet doesn't seem to get much of a kickback, and so here in this recession, we're seeing raising fares and cutting routes, which is counterproductive in many ways. But that's what happens when you don't have a subsidy arrangement. So the company has to at least break even. Just about any public transportation system or any transportation system, the airlines have been alleged to get a lot of subsidies in the form of access to airports that's underpriced, regulatory oversight that isn't fully priced. Highway system. The highways are funded by a road fund from the federal government, and the gas tax does not fully fund that spending. So road systems are subsidized, and you could look at that as maybe you could construe that as a natural monopoly problem. The marginal cost of using a mile of highway is essentially zero, right? So that's the marginal cost we know is higher than that. There's some wear and tear on the road with every vehicle. Amtrak gets in a lot of political heat for being regulated this way. All right, I'm running out of time here, but I just wanted to wave my hands at one more possible regulatory structure, and that is the state ownership. And here, the state would take direct ownership because remember this problem of getting the firm to minimize costs. How do you get the managers to minimize costs? They have other goals besides minimizing costs. They know any costs they incur will be allowed to be passed on to consumers somewhat uncritically, or with regulatory authorities lacking the information necessary to regulate that effectively. Some states have some government entities have decided just to obtain the natural monopoly themselves and run it themselves, and by hiring managers directly, they can ensure that or they can try to ensure that some of these the lack of the incentive to reduce prices is mitigated, because now the managers work for the government and the government entities can hire and fire them. So this is called state ownership. I could probably think of a lot of examples if I gave it time, but the example that's yelling out at us is the Forest Grove Power and Light. Forest Grove is one of the few communities, maybe the only one in the Portland metro area, where the city actually long ago bought the power, the retail power distributor, and they buy their power wholesale from the Bonneville Power Administration. But Forest Grove owns its own power company, Forest Grove Power and Light, and hires and fires those managers directly. And electricity rates in Forest Grove are much lower than they are elsewhere in the metro area, because we don't pay some natural monopolist a normal rate of return. I don't know, 8 or 10%. We just get that in the form of electricity prices that are 8 or 10% lower than what electricity prices are elsewhere in the region. I guess I'll leave it at that.
Made with Doodlecast Pro.